Yonathan Shiran is SystemiQ's partner, and he is leading all the activities of the company around plastics and packaging. He was the program director and lead author of Breaking the Plastics Wave, which was, I think the first study based on modeling different scenarios, starting from business as usual up to a high ambition and fully scaled combination of reduce, reuse, and recycling, and everything between. And the story behind plastics treaty futures, which Yoni is going to present today, is the following. About a year ago, just when we at Röchling Foundation were considering about how a really helpful contribution to the global plastics treaty could look like, SystemiQ came up with the idea to develop a data-driven tool that allows the international negotiators to calculate the real impact of their decisions in advance. And that immediately made a lot of sense to us, because at that time we felt that everybody was talking about the plastics treaty and making specific demands from all the different points of view, but nobody seemed to come up with any evidence in terms of the different scenarios of a treaty. So we teamed up with Minderoo Foundation in order to help SystemiQ to create a tool that would bring not just arguments, but facts into the discussions about the treaty. And the overall questions, of course, is what kind of a global commitment do we really need to stop plastic pollution by 2040? And right in time for INC4 in Ottawa, just a few weeks ago, Plastics Treaty Futures was born, and consequently, we named the subtitle Briefing for INC Negotiators. But Yoni and his team did not just develop data architecture. More than that, they dived into a deep dialogue with the delegations from many different countries, with the high ambitioned ones, with the showstoppers, and with the undecided. So Yoni today is one of the few people, I guess, who really got an overall view of the state of the play and the dynamics behind it. And that's why we are going to do two things today. First, Yoni will present Plastic Treaty Futures and, of course, the results of the modeling work. And after that, we will take a look behind the scenes of the negotiations and discuss the chances of plastics treaty that really makes an impact. Okay, so far. Yoni, it's great to have you here today. I hope you're ready.
Ready.
Then the stage is yours. Very warm welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Uwe, for the warm words. And thank you for the invitation today. And thank you for all the support over the last year. And thank you to all of you for joining and taking time off your busy days to join this lunch, this conversation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. My name is Yonathan Shiran. As Uwe said, I'm a partner at SystemiQ. For those who don't know SystemiQ, we are a B corporation who works on the system changes that are needed to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. And plastic has really been at the heart of SystemiQ's work since we started 8 years ago. And so you may wonder, why on earth did my team and I spend years now modeling the stocks and flows of the plastic system? And for me, it started in my first trip to Indonesia back in 2018. I remember being on a beach in Indonesia, covered in plastic, as far as the eye can see. I remember, the awful sights and the smell of decay and the difficult conversations in the houses of the local village people. And when you are there, as many of you have probably been, you wonder, we've got to have a better plastic system. We have a wonderful material called plastic, but we need to find ways to make a more circular economy work. And we need to find ways to get all this plastic out of the environment. So I'm going to share my screen now. But that is when we really started back in 2018, doing all the modeling work around plastic. The first one we did, as Uwe mentioned, was Breaking the Plastic Wave, which was a 2-year research project to really try to understand the economic, environmental, and social implications of different plastic solutions. It was the first effort of this kind, looking at a global analysis, a global model, which we did together with the Pew Charitable Trusts and experts from around the world. And it ended up getting published in the cover of Science, which was a big deal because it gave us kind of the scientific stamp, let's say, an independent peer review in a world where the plastic topic is so highly debated. You know, what are the solutions? What are the assumptions? Obviously, there's hundreds of billions of dollars on the table, and so we try to provide, you know, evidence and facts as independently and unbiased as we can. So that was a starting point. And then in the treaty discussions, we've been heavily engaged in the treaty discussions since day one, or even before the treaty formally began. But our real purpose was to inform negotiators through this modeling of the environmental, economic, and social implications of different treaty scenarios that have been inspired by listening to the positions of different countries and listening to the conversation of what different countries are asking for. And the reason we thought this was important is because if you look at the zero draft or the options paper or any of the documents coming from the INC, they're all great documents to shape, you know, to outline for negotiators what are the options that they're discussing on and what are the key topics to be discussed on. But those documents, none of those documents were designed to explain to negotiators what are the economic and environmental and social implications of different choices. And so if negotiators want to end plastic pollution by 2040, which has been the goal, you know, the mandate that they have received, we think that without the proper evidence and analysis, it's very hard to do that. Looking at a document with many options without telling you how much the different options cost and what their impact is going to be, it's very hard to negotiate that way, we thought. And so this is meant to be our contribution to that process. So the model covers all elements of plastics. So the model is broken down to 9 sectors. Clearly packaging, a very important one, but also household goods, textiles, electronics, construction, transportation, agriculture, fishing gear, and microplastics. So we try to cover all the main categories of plastic. And it's a global model, but we recognize that obviously every region is very, very different, not just in terms of policies, but also infrastructure, economics. Everything is different by these regions. So the model is broken down to 9 regions, as you can see on the screen. So essentially it's 9 different models for each of the 9 different sectors, and then we aggregate everything up to the global analysis. But the model itself is quite sophisticated. We've been building on our first model from 7 years ago and building layers on layers on top of that to the latest version that we have now, which is what we used for the treaty modeling work. In terms of how we thought about the scenarios specifically for the treaty modeling, is we try to disaggregate on the 2 main dimensions that we think are being discussed in the treaty process. And some of you will be involved in the process, so you're probably familiar with some of this. But the first main question that negotiators are asking, or the different viewpoints, is the dimension you have here on the y-axis, which is the scope of action. Is it a full life cycle treaty that covers end-to-end from upstream, you know, questions like design and reduction and reuse and so on, all the way down to downstream, recycling, disposal, mismanaged plastic? Or is it the downstream only treaty discussion? So that's the first dimension we looked at. And the second dimension is the degree of coordination. Again, those of you who have been part of the treaty have probably are probably acutely aware, but one of the main discussion points between countries is, should it be a global treaty, global action that is based on consensus on regulation, shared definitions, shared ambition? Of course, we're never going to have the same targets for everywhere in the world, but the shared level of ambition everywhere in the world. Versus on the left side, you have national action. So it's a much more Paris-style agreement. Paris, I'm talking about the climate agreement. So much more, every country has their own targets, but there's no binding targets or guidelines or things like that. That has been a very big tension point between countries, with the more ambitious countries obviously arguing, so Europe and other high ambition countries arguing for global action, while other countries are arguing for national action. So these 2 dimensions have determined the 4 scenarios that we've been modeling, and I will show you today the results of that. In terms of when we say kind of a full life cycle versus not, what that means, we've defined 15 policies that we think cover the full life cycle. So if you look on the left-hand side, in the interest of time, I won't take you through all of that. I'm happy to share the materials, or you can also find it online. But essentially, we've identified 15 policies that we think would be a holistic package of what is needed to really drive system change in the plastic system and really change the picture in that beach of Indonesia that I was telling you about in the beginning. We've broken these policies down to 5 pillars. So there's pillar A is about reduction of production and consumption of primary materials. Pillar B is about the elimination of avoidable and problematic plastics and chemicals of concern. Pillar C is about expanding safe circularity, so including reuse, including durability, recycling, and so on. Pillar D is about controlled disposal. And Pillar E is a transversal pillar on microplastics, which are also an important part of this issue, especially in the global north, especially in countries like in regions like Europe. So this is what the full life cycle would include. So the scenarios in the full life cycle include all these 15 policies. And on the waste management scenario, so the downstream only is what you see on the right side. So it's where you have only the levers there, levers 8 to 12, which are more the downstream levers. Again, I won't take you policy by policy, but the one on the left is quite comprehensive. So it includes everything from EPR to reuse targets, recycling targets, collection targets, also guidelines on production, on application-specific levers, and so bans on problematic materials and phase-outs. So it's a pretty robust and holistic package of policies that we've looked at. With that, let me take you through the key findings. I'll try to do it briefly so we can have proper time for questions and the discussion. I'd definitely love to hear from you guys what you think and what your questions are. I'll take you through the findings through 4 main conclusions that we've reached. The first conclusion is that a coordinated and full life cycle treaty is needed if we're going to end plastic pollution by 2040. From the 4 scenarios that we looked at, that I showed at the beginning, it was only the one that has action across the life cycle, so upstream and downstream, in a way that is, has global rules and robust international coordination. Only that scenario has meaningful reduction of plastic pollution. The other scenarios don't have enough. So let me show you what that looks like in numbers. This chart is a bit complex, but I'll explain it to you. Essentially on the left, so this is 2019. The numbers you're looking at is end-of-life fate of plastic waste in different scenarios. So the green is recycled plastic, the yellow is disposed plastic, so landfill incineration, and the red is mismanaged plastic. Of course, most of that is in the global south, but this is a global picture. And so in 2019, we have a high share, roughly 30% of mismanaged plastic. The next chart shows, the next bar is about BAU. So essentially we're saying there's an 87% growth in mismanaged plastic. Again, think about that picture in the beach of Indonesia, 87% growth of that by 2040. This is, of course, an unacceptable picture. And then when we look at the 4 different scenarios that I was talking about, you can see that only the global full life cycle scenario, so the one that has global ambition and that has full life cycle action, only that has a meaningful reduction or significant reduction in the red areas, the mismanaged waste. All the other scenarios are an improvement relative to BAU, but none of them are enough. They roughly take us back to 2019 levels by 2040, which I think we can all agree is not good enough. So this is one strong argument that we're kind of presenting to negotiators to say, we need an ambitious treaty, we need global alignment, we need global rules, and we need a full life cycle. When you look at the production side, we say in this scenario, essentially the global full life cycle scenario, essentially what it means is that there would be a shift from primary or certain shift from primary production to secondary production. Of course, we still need primary production of plastics. I don't think we can get out of that by 2040, despite what some of the NGOs may be asking for. I think primary production will still be needed by 2040 under any scenario, but we can see a significant shift to secondary production. That's the green bucket over here. And we also have a significant amount of elimination, reduction, substitution. So these are things like reducing avoidable plastics. For example, when there's over packaging, we've tried to look at quite granularly, in a pretty high level of detail, opportunities to identify over packaging or uses of plastics that are not necessary, but also thinking about an ambitious shift towards reuse models and other new delivery models that could reduce the overall amount of waste in the system. And the third chart is looking at greenhouse gases. So what would the different scenarios mean for greenhouse gases? Today, the plastic system globally is about 1.9 gigatons of plastic. That's today, so it's a significant amount of the global emissions. By BAU, this would be growing by 63% to 3 gigatons by 2040, clearly misaligned with the Paris Agreement. If you look at the 4 different scenarios that we've modeled, the only one that has at least a flattening of emissions is the global full life cycle scenario, or a 40% reduction relative to BAU. Of course, this too is not enough, and this too is not aligned with the Paris Agreement. But there would have to be other levers that we did not model, such as to decarbonize the system, such as electrifying crackers and changing feedstocks and decarbonizing the grid. So there's a number of other things that could be done to take this down to zero by 2040. We haven't modeled that, but if you look at just the circularity levers that we have focused on and the reduction and recycling levers that we have focused on, this is a scenario that has the biggest impact on greenhouse gases. So that was the first finding, that we really need kind of global action, and it really needs to be upstream and downstream. The second main finding is that inaction is very, very costly. So if you look at the cost to governments only, the business as usual scenario would cost to governments, to the public sector, $200 billion more than this scenario that we're talking about, the global rural scenario. And it would have much more mismanaged waste. So the much more mismanaged waste we already saw in the previous charts. If you look at the cost to the public sector, BAU would cost in total $1.7 trillion just for the waste management for the public sector of the plastic system globally over 15 years. So this is a 15-year time period. So it's roughly 100 billion per year. That's roughly what we're spending globally to manage our plastic system in terms of collection, sorting, landfilling, and incineration globally. We think that figure could be decreased by $200 billion in a global full life cycle scenario. A big part of that saving is because if we have less plastic in the system, less waste in the system, because we have more reuse and we reduce unnecessary plastic and avoidable plastic, then that would, of course, save money to governments in terms of collection and landfilling and incineration and so on. So this is the picture that we're presenting, again, to negotiators to hopefully increase their ambition and increase their desire for a scenario like this. The third finding that we're looking at is that financing mechanisms are critical, because even though the cost to governments and to the private sector on a global level would be more attractive in this scenario, if you do zoom into the global south, into low and middle income countries, the costs are more expensive because they would need to build substantial infrastructure that is not in place today. So if you look at a regional perspective, this scenario would come with extra costs to those regions, and they would need support, and we would need financing mechanisms in place. So we are saying that tackling mismanaged plastic waste does require effective funding mechanisms to increase public spending on waste management by about 50% in low and middle income countries. Again, this is a big topic of conversation in the treaty of how this is going to be financed and who's going to finance it and so on. So we try to contribute to that by calculating some of the numbers that the different scenarios would require. So the global north, so this is, North America, Europe, and high-income countries in Asia, which is, Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on. These countries would actually save a significant amount of money under the scenario because these countries already have the infrastructure in place. And so if there's less waste, then there's less of a need to spend on OPEX and so on. For the global south countries, so low and middle income countries here at the bottom, even in this global full life cycle scenario, they would see a growth of spending, by our calculations, about a $50 billion growth in spending. And so this would require to find ways to finance this addition. And this chart, which I think is very important, is trying to quantify the gap, because there's a big discussion in the treaty of how much money is needed, to finance the gap. So this chart answers that. Essentially, the BAU scenario requires in total $900 billion over these 15-year period in the low and middle income countries. The global full life cycle scenario, so the one that we're talking about, the high ambitious scenario, is $50 billion more expensive in those countries. That's the $50 billion that we just saw on the previous slide. If you look at the current level of spend in the governments in the global south, so all the low and middle income countries combined, if you take that forward, projected forward 15 years, and account for inflation and all the rest of it, they're projected to spend about $650 billion. And that's the gap that we see. $300 billion is the gap between what we need and what we're projected to see. So this $300 billion, and you can see the CapEx and OpEx split here, is our best estimate of the funding gap that is needed. And again, we're sharing this with countries as they're doing the negotiations to say this is the amount of money that would be needed to plug in the hole over 15 years, of course. So roughly 20 billion per year to fill in the holes, to build the infrastructure that we need in the global south to properly handle our plastic waste. This is just for the plastic part. Of course, some people will say, well, you cannot just build infrastructure for plastic. You cannot collect only plastic. If you collect plastic, you have to collect everything else. So if you account for that as well, then we're talking about a 900 billion gap. Of course, that would be much more expensive. But this would also deal with many other problems, right? So if you start collecting all the organic waste, for example, and treating that properly, then of course that has big benefits also from a climate perspective, because you're saving a lot of methane, and has many other health benefits and many other things. So these are the numbers: 300 billion just for plastic, 900 billion if you also include organic waste. So that was finding number 3. And the last finding that I will leave you with today is to say that fears of economic dislocation are probably misplaced. I think that many people are asking, what will happen to jobs? What will happen to the economy if all this plastic reduction comes in? What does it mean from an economic perspective? And what we see is that across all regions, so in the global north, in China, but also in the global south, everywhere, there are shifts in economic activity under the scenario towards more circular business models and materials management, but they create new value pools that more than offset any decline in the economic value or the economic activity of primary plastic production. And what that looks like is, here you have the different scenarios, so 2019, BAU, and the 4 scenarios that we've been looking at. And here you have the different activities, the main activities from the plastic system. And what you see is that from a primary production perspective, the numbers are roughly stable between now and 2040 under the scenario. And so this 550 billion bubble here. These bubbles represent the value pools. I should have said that. These are the value pools. So how much money sits in each of these activities? What is the value of each of these activities? Again, this is a global picture. We can break it down into a regional picture as well. But for now, I'm sharing the global picture. You can see that this primary production is roughly stable, and same thing for plastic conversion. But you can see that there's a $600 billion opportunity of new value pools around secondary plastic, so recycling, substitution, reuse, new delivery models. We estimate, based on the analysis, that this will be roughly a $600 billion value pool opportunity. So there is economic potential, and this also comes with jobs and all the rest of it, but it is a different type of growth than what we would see in BAU, which has mainly around producing more virgin plastic and not so much the circular solutions. This is the last slide I'll leave you to today, and then we'll open it up for questions. But when you look at the economic activity per region, then you see that, again, in all regions we see growth, and you can see what that looks like for secondary production, so recycling, what that looks like for substitution, for reuse, and you see that across all the regions that we looked at, there is net growth. And sorry, this is going to be the last analysis, is the jobs implication. So again, we see that in all these scenarios, there is a net growth in jobs. We estimate about 70% growth in jobs globally in the plastic system relative to today. And we can split those jobs into, primary production or other parts of the value chain. But we think that the employment question that is being raised in the treaty should not be a major concern, because the circular economy does provide many jobs as well. So that was it. That was my attempt to do the very brief version. Of course, the document is a lot deeper and goes into a lot more analysis. If you're interested, you have the QR code there. You can look at the full report. There's also a dynamic version on the website. There's also regional analysis. So basically, we go into each of these charts that I just showed you in a regional perspective. So that if there's a specific region, either Europe or other parts of the world that you're interested to see the impact on them, that is all included in the regional analysis. And we also have a scenario explorer tool, which I invite all of you to check out online and try to play with, where essentially you can play with different scenarios and you can build your own, scenarios, saying if different countries or different regions have different ambition levels or different policies, what could that look like? What would be the impact on plastic waste? What would be the impact on primary production, greenhouse gases, costs, all these other things we talked about. So that was it. I hope that was interesting and informative. And I will open it up now for questions.
Thank you so much, Yoni. I think that was really interesting and gives room for plenty of questions. But first of all, before we dive into the different scenarios and how to deal with them, maybe you could give us briefly an insight in terms of methodology, because I think many people will ask, how did you feed the tool? What kind of data did you use? How did you collect them?
Yes, very happy to do that. Let me pull up a slide here, if that is where there's interest. Let me present here a slide. Essentially, what we've done. Can you see my slide? Can you see this? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can see a slide.
Okay. Essentially, at the heart of the model, that we have a system map, which tries to, which is essentially how we model the flows and the stocks in the plastic system. And this is a representation of that. So essentially, we start with plastic waste. I'll come back to the green boxes in a second, but we start with plastic waste, and we look in each region how much of that is collected versus uncollected. And out of the collected, you have a collecting and sorting area here, where we try to look at the different paths that plastic can follow. Some of that will end up in recycling. Some of that will end up in disposal. So that's landfill, incineration, and so on. And some of that will, of course, end up in mismanaged. So we did this analysis. So we have we quantified each of these boxes and each of these arrows for each of the regions that we talked about and for each of the sectors that we talked about between now and 2040. And we started out with BAU. And then we worked with a number of experts and scientists to try to estimate how the different scenarios and the different policies impact these flows over time. So, for example, if you had a ban on a certain type of plastic, then you would remove that volume from the system. Or if you had an incentive to go to recycling, then you would have more plastic going to recycling and so on. So different scenarios represent different volumes that would flow into each of these parts of the system. And then on top of that, we build a number of layers. So we have an economic layer that quantifies the cost per ton for each of these boxes, again, in each region of the world for every sector. So it's quite complex and it's quite granular. But once you have the cost per ton and you have the tons in every scenario, then you can multiply it out to know the economics. We have a similar layer for greenhouse gases per ton, and we have a similar layer for jobs per ton, and so on. All this data is transparent, so we've published everything. You can find the technical appendix on the website that has all this data. It's a very long and detailed technical appendix, but you can find all the assumptions there. And we've been working with dozens of scientists and experts to validate all these assumptions and to validate this methodology. Again, this is the work that took a lot more than 1 year, so we've been working on this since 2018. Now we just adapted it to the treaty version. I hope that explains the methodology at a high level.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Before I now hand over to Marius, because I see there are a lot of interesting questions in the chat already. Just one more question, Yoni, from my side. You presented the results at INC4 just a couple of weeks ago in Canada. How did it resonate?
I think it resonates a lot. I think there's many countries that are deeply interested in this kind of analysis. We held two events in Ottawa that were very well attended. One of them was done together with the OECD, because the OECD has also done their own modeling and their own kind of work. We've tried to collaborate where we can and share assumptions, but the methodology is quite different. But the results are very similar. So the exact numbers are different, but the overall conclusions that I talked to you today are also similar in the OECD report. Maybe some of you have seen that as well. And so I think it strengthens the conviction within policy, within negotiators, to have these two different sources pointing to a similar direction. I think it resonates quite a bit. We've had we've been talking with over 30 countries about the results and spending time with their teams and their delegations to explain the methodology, explain the assumptions, and explain the outputs. We have several countries who have been asking to do country-specific analysis. Uwe, you're aware of this, but some of the countries have been asking, can you show me the results for my own country so that we can try to inform our own positions for the treaty? So I think in general, it has been resonating very well.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Now, Marius, it's your turn. You have an eye on the chat. What are the most burning questions?
Thanks, Yoni, also from my end. It was a great presentation. I think the chat during your presentation was rather quiet because everyone was so captivated by all these numbers and all your slides. But we do have a few questions. Number one being about the social impact that you also talked about. Which social impact indicators did you analyze, and how were they considered in all the 4 different scenarios you explained? Question number one.
Great question. The main social indicator that we were able to quantify is on the jobs perspective, which I showed you, which shows that a circular economy, would be job creating, especially in the global south, right? If you separate that into global south and global north, you see that scenario is more favorable for jobs in the global south, which I think is something important for negotiators to be aware of. Of course, there's many other social impacts of plastic, but some of them are hard to quantify. So health is something we looked at quite a bit. It's hard to quantify, but we looked at that qualitatively, and we talked with many health experts. It's not going to be a surprise to anyone on this call that a better managed plastic system that has, phase out of problematic chemicals of concern and other problematic materials, and has better design requirements, has more recycling and more reuse and more circular economy, that system will have health benefits, significant health benefits, and also less plastic pollution. Again, if you go back to the beach in Indonesia, that is covered in plastic, that has a social impact, not just from the impact on tourism and so on. But when I was in the beach of Indonesia, and again, many of you have probably been as well, children are playing on that beach, probably not even aware that there's sand underneath, right? So that is a situation that we're talking about in many countries in the global south. That does have social impacts, and I think that a better managed plastic system would go a long way to addressing that. We also talk about greenhouse gases and so on. That's environmental, but it's also linked to social, because as we all know, climate change has a disproportionate impact on poor people and poor communities on the global south. So everything ends up being linked up. And so I think the social benefits are quite clear of the circular economy.
Thank you, Yoni. And to that, on the job creation part, you say, are these jobs only in the end of life management sector, or do your results also reflect new jobs in the entire scope of a circular economy? That was the second part of the question.
Yes, definitely definitely the full life cycle. There's a lot of job creation in new delivery models, particularly in reuse models. So anything that is around reuse, around repair, refurbish. So reuse is more for packaging. For the other sectors, automotive, construction, and so on, we're talking more about repair, refurbish, and so on. But these activities typically are more labor intensive than primary production. Primary production is more capex intensive, but the circular economy solutions are more labor intensive, and they're more local jobs rather than jobs overseas. So I think there are clear benefits from an employment perspective of a circular economy, all of which has been accounted for in the modeling work.
Thank you so much. And then there is another question on the role, whether you looked at the role that bioplastic, as in addition to recycling, which role do these play in any of these scenarios?
Yes, bioplastic is a term that is used to, I think, talk about two categories of plastic that are quite different. One is bio-based plastics, so plastics that are made out of biological feedstock, and one is biodegradable plastic that would degrade, or compostable packaging, as an example. We've looked at each of those separately. So on biodegradable compostable packaging, we think there is a role for that to play, and we've tried to quantify what role that has in different geographies, in different for packaging applications, and what would be the cost of that. We see there is a role for that to play, but it's not a silver bullet based on our analysis. It's not something that would replace all plastics. It's not relevant for all categories, and it's not. And the economics are somewhat challenging, so it wouldn't work in all geographies. But I think, based on our analysis, it does have a role of about between, I think, roughly 5 to 8% of the overall plastic was our conclusion. Again, you have the detailed output and the detailed work on the website, and I'm also happy, I shared my email, so I'm also happy to follow up with more detail if anybody is interested. And then on the bio-based, we focused a bit less on that for this work because that would impact the greenhouse gas side, but less on the things that less on pollution and things that the treaties focused on. But we have looked at that in a separate report that we did for Europe called Reshaping Plastics. And our conclusion is that bio-based plastic could reduce the greenhouse gas footprint, and it would be one of the levers that we would need to meet a net zero plastic system and a Paris aligned plastic system. And again, I can share more information about that offline if anybody's interested.
Thank you so much, Yoni. And then there was one very specific question, which was the first one. When you presented the 9 sectors that you looked at, there was one question in which category the medical waste would fall.
Yeah, good one. We have a 10th category, which is other, which is a combination of many small things, and that's where the medical plastic sits. In general, that's a very difficult category to look for alternatives because we know that plastic in that category, they're very high value plastic, oftentimes engineering plastics, it's not the commodity material that you see in packaging, and obviously they deliver very high value to society. So in general, we are focused a bit less in that sector because we think that plastic is probably a good material where it is used in medical devices and medical sector in general, and so we didn't propose to make too many changes there.
Thank you so much, Uwe. That's it from the chat, and if you don't mind, I have a question as well.
Sure.
Because you said that it resonated really well with policymakers, and the room was full. Like, I know this is very hard in policy making, but was there maybe even an instance where you felt that the study or the results actually changed a policymaker's position on a certain issue?
Yeah, look, the positions of countries, it's a complex thing, right? It's not like a 0 or 1, so it's a complex thing, and there's many topics, and the negotiations are very, very complex, as I'm sure you're aware. But we've seen many situations of many countries. I mean, one example I can share is from Brazil. The Minister of Environment, I think Brazil is showing up in a more ambitious way to the treaty discussions than some people have expected. The Environmental Ministry, which showed up to Ottawa and to all the INCs, is trying to really raise the ambition, but I think they have some local, some pushback from other ministries within the government and within the Brazilian delegation. And so they're trying to ask questions, and they have real concerns about, Brazil being a plastic producing countries, what will happen to jobs under different scenarios, and a few other concerns. And so they came and they're asking questions about, what does this mean for Brazil? What would this mean under different scenarios for employment, for economic impact, but also environmental impact? And I think analysis like this, so Brazil is one of the countries that we're trying to do modeling work for, and I think analysis like this can help inform, their internal debates and can help alleviate some of the concerns that are within certain ministries of the Brazilian government, and will allow the environment ministry, what it needs to raise the ambition. And like Brazil is just one example, but there's a number of other countries. Malaysia is another one, Vietnam, South Africa, India, the US, many countries which we've been engaging in. They've been very interested in the results. UNEP themselves, right? So Inger Anderson, managing director or executive director of UNEP, is aware of this work. I think she's been using some of the data and some of the outputs in some of her conversations, and her team as well. Sheila, has been going very detailed into the analysis, and she feels that specifically for the on-defense countries are the ones that we're trying to focus most of this work on, because the high ambition countries already have high ambition. Some countries will never agree. There's no amount of modeling that will convince them. But I think there are some on-defense countries, like the ones I mentioned: Brazil, US, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, Colombia, a list of 20, 30 countries that I think a lot of this treaty will depend on what direction they go into. They're the ones that we're really trying to focus the modeling work. And so far, I think we've definitely seen impact.
And Uwe, if you don't mind, just now 2 more questions in the chat were raised. One of them being, you mentioned the financing gap. To what extent could EPR systems and plastic credits be helpful to at least cover the expenses for collection and recycling, so that other investments could go into prevention and repair reuse models? So what's your stance on the role of EPR systems and credits?
Yeah, great question. EPR systems, we think, but also the model suggests, that is a absolutely critical tool that we have to our disposal, and is a big part of filling this finance gap that we talk about, the 300 billion. It's over 15 years, let's remember, so it's about 20 billion per year. But this gap will not, we know the Paris Agreement, they've talked about 100 billion of financing, and they haven't, and the rich countries in the world still haven't found the full 100 billion, right? So I don't have illusions that rich countries will magically find $300 billion to provide to the global south. And therefore, EPR, I think, is an absolutely critical mechanism. When deployed correctly, it has proven very effective to finance the system and to finance solutions and to create producer responsibility. Hopefully, we can see an expansion of EPR to the world. I think that's starting already. In the US, I think EPR was a forbidden word in the US 5 years ago, and we have now 4 states that have implemented EPR and 12 other states that are considering it. We have countries like Brazil and Chile in South America. We have countries in Asia and Africa looking into it. So I think it is getting momentum, and hopefully the treaty can help accelerate that momentum towards EPR and help align on universal criteria and eco-modulation and how to get EPR right. And I think EPR needs to expand beyond just packaging, but also into other sectors as well, again, as a solution for to invest into infrastructure, and not just into downstream infrastructure like collection and recycling and so on, but also into upstream infrastructure like reuse, which also requires financing. And I think EPR can play a source for that. I'll just give you one number. It's a bit beyond the question, but I'll just leave you with one number that I think is very, very powerful to understand the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. In the world today, there are 2 billion people without collection. This is not our number. This is from the UN, right? 2 billion people in the world, obviously most in the global south, do not have waste collection services. The global population between now and 2040 will increase by 1.7 billion people, again, most in the global south. So 1.7 billion plus 2 billion, it's roughly 4 billion people that we need to connect to collection services between now and 2040. If you divide that number, 4 billion people, by the number of days left between now and 2040, you quickly find that we need to, connect 500,000 people every single day between now and 2040. 500,000 people every single day. Think about that. Every day, including Saturday, Sunday, Christmas, every day from now to 2040. That is the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. And that's why we need finance. But finance is likely not going to solve all of that. And that's why reuse is important. We need to kind of reduce in the source, because collection and recycling alone is never going to solve this gap. And that's why we need all the solutions, which is what we've been talking about. So that was a long answer to a short question, but I think just to put the importance on EPR. And then second part of the question was plastic credits. Plastic credits have been talked about a lot, and we've been looking at plastic credits. I think plastic credits have merit. when they're deployed, or if they're deployed in the right way, and that's a big if. And we've written papers about that, so I can share offline, but essentially, we need to make sure these credits are additional and kind of having all the standards of credits the way they should be. We've all seen the criticism that climate credits have received recently, and also plastic credits. And we also need to, when we work with companies to deploy solutions, we also need to make sure that plastic credits is a last resort and not the only thing companies are doing. So companies need to, again, make sure they reduce the waste where they can, make sure they're shifting towards recyclable, recycled, reuse, all these things that we talked about, and only use plastic credits to deal with the delta, as opposed to being a silver bullet that solves the problem for them.
Thank you so much. And two more questions from the chat. One of them being, in how far did you consider this different CO2 saving potential for different recycling technologies? Could you just elaborate on that a little?
Yes, we looked at recycling technologies quite deeply. We looked at mechanical recycling, we looked at different versions of chemical recycling, and so on. It's a very hot topic, right? The savings. I think in general, mechanical recycling clearly is CO2 benefit, or there's clear CO2 savings compared to virgin plastic. Of course, it depends how much recycled content you're talking about, but you can see anywhere between 30 and 70% CO2 savings from recycled content, from recycling. So mechanical recycling is something that we strongly think is part of the solution. Of course, we need to look into the microplastic challenge and so on, but from a CO2 perspective, for sure. Chemical recycling is a bit more challenging. Some chemical recycling technologies, in particular pyrolysis, has many questions around the energy usage and the CO2 implications and so on. So there is a question of how they can improve their yields over time and how they can improve their CO2 profile over time. Other technologies such as depolymerization and so on, I think have proven to be more CO2 friendly. We have looked at different technologies. Again, it's all in the report. I'm happy to talk about more details offline as well.
Thank you so much. And then there was a follow-up question on the social impact indicators. There was a question if there's anything, there's this discussion around just financing transition, and if there was any other quantifiable indicator besides job creation that could measure the just transition efforts.
Yeah, just transition is a big topic. We've actually done a separate report, which I can put the link on here in a second, which looked at specifically living wages for the informal sector. And it was done separately because we can't put everything in one report, but it very much connects to this one. And we've also presented that in Ottawa in the context of the treaty. And what we looked at is, what is the living income of the waste pickers in different countries? We started with Brazil, India, and Ghana. And we did a survey partnering with local NGOs to try to get as much data as possible of their living income today. And what is the minimum? And what we found is that on average, waste pickers are earning between $3 and $6 per day, depending on, it depends on a few things. There's a range, but roughly speaking, that's what we're talking about, $3 to $6 per day per waste picker. And then we looked at what is the minimum. Sorry, not a minimum wage, but what is a livable wage? So we looked at what is a decent, looking at four things, looking at cost of nutrition, so food, cost of shelter, cost of clothing, and cost of health. So looking at very basic services that somebody would call, this is a decent livable income. And we found, sadly, quite big gaps between what people are earning in practice and what a minimum decent livelihood would be. And we quantified that in those countries. The gap is roughly 50%, 30 to 50%. But we've also seen pockets of places where actually waste pickers are able to meet the minimum living standards. And so there are ways of making it work that under certain conditions, it can work. And we found several examples in Brazil and other places. And we're expanding that work into now 12 other countries and partnering with dozens of NGOs around the world to try to bring the data in. So the just transition question is a very important one that needs to be looked at side by side to the environmental challenges of the plastic problem, something that we and many others have been looking at. So thanks for the question. I'll put here in the meantime the study if anybody wants to look at that in any more detail.
Yeah, that's already been asked. Please share the link on the informal sector. Thank you so much, Uwe. I think that's it from the chat for now, and over to you again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marius. Yes, after the very detailed questions and answers in the last few minutes, I would like to look behind the curtain of when we're talking about the INCs and the treaty in general. You mentioned, Joni, that you've been involved, quite deeply involved from day one. I would like to ask you about, well, the state of the game right now. Is it, from your point of view, how do you see the chances to achieve an effective agreement in the end? And is it worth the enormous effort the international community takes at the moment?
Yeah, wonderful question, Uwe. There's many ways of answering it. I'll say, in general, I think I'm an optimistic person, and I've tried to stay optimistic throughout this entire process. But it's not an easy process. In fact, it's a very difficult process. Nobody ever expected it to be easy. From day one, when we said, let's negotiate something that we know is so difficult. There's 194 countries negotiating. Nobody ever expected it to be difficult. But I think it has proven, if we're very honest, I think it has proven even more difficult than what most people expected, certainly what I expected. The first three, so for those who are maybe not super close, it's a 2.5-year negotiation over 5 negotiating rounds. Ottawa was round number 4, so that was INC 4. I've had the pleasure to be in each of those rounds. So I've had a close look at what's happening on the ground. I think in the first 3 INCs, progress has been quite limited. So in Uruguay, in Paris, in Nairobi, there's been very little movement and not enough discussions about substance and about content and about text options. We started, the chair of the negotiation tried to, in INC 2, put a 0 draft, kind of a 0 version start with an options paper before INC 2. What are the options that we're discussing? And I think that paper was quite good in capturing different options. And then there's a 0 draft put out before INC 3, saying here's 2 or 3 options that we should discuss for each of the main 12 topics of discussion. That looks like a pretty promising start. But essentially, the countries could not agree on any of these options, but they could not even agree on that document. So at the end of INC 3, which is the 3rd round out of 5, we ended up with a much longer document. Instead of being 20, 30 pages, we had like an 80-page document with all the options that any country has ever imagined in it, it's a very difficult document to make any meaningful negotiation on, because it's so long and complicated and has all the options on earth that, how can you negotiate something like that? So that was a pretty, I think, a difficult moment. Ottawa INC 4, I think, was the best INC. So that's where kind of some optimism definitely comes back. I think it was definitely the best INC. Maybe it wasn't a very high bar or very high bar, but nonetheless, negotiators, I think, took a different tone. I think UNEP and the INC, the Canadian government, did a really good job, I think, at getting countries kind of more serious, and we've seen a lot more progress. There's still a massive mountain to climb for INC 5, and they're now trying to get intersessional work. So it's still not going to be easy, but at least we've seen concrete text offered by countries. So the UK, for example, together with Thailand, put forward a concrete suggestion for what the treaty could say about avoidable and problematic plastics. Switzerland also put a concrete text about that. A few other countries offering text around different areas. Again, there's still a massive mountain to climb, but I think areas that we've made some progress are around problematic and avoidable plastics, around EPR and financing. We talked about that today. I think they've made a bit of progress. Still no conclusions, but at least they've streamlined the number of options. I think under a number of other issues, they've made some progress. Not so much on reuse, not so much on the informal sector, not so much on the upstream elements. So 50-50. Does that answer your question, Uwe? Sorry, I was a bit long, but it's a loaded question.
But I've got one additional question, maybe. You were mentioning the different, well, let's name it coalitions. the high ambitioned ones, the skeptical ones, and the undecided. Maybe you can give us very roughly an overview who is in which camp.
Yeah, you're talking about the countries?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because there's also industry coalitions, which I think is also very relevant and maybe relevant for this group. But I'll start with the countries, and then we'll talk about the companies as well. In terms of the companies, there's a high ambition coalition, which I think now has 59 countries. It is essentially and that's led by Norway and Rwanda, but I think Canada has also play a big leadership role as well. That has all of the EU. So Germany, of course, is included, and all the other EU countries. It also has Canada, about half of the countries in South America, not Brazil, but most of the other ones, or half of the other ones. It has about half of the countries in Africa, and has a few countries in Asia. So that's a coalition, again, that's been consistently asking for, and having ministers and others consistently asking for, an ambitious treaty that is roughly along the lines of what we talked about. The first work that we did for the treaty at SystemiQ was for the High Ambition Coalition, and we helped them define what the high ambition scenario could look like. And roughly speaking, is the 15 policies that I showed you in that circle in the beginning slide. That is roughly speaking what the High Ambition Coalition is asking for. It also includes Japan, importantly, because it was very clear in the beginning what their position is. Then you have a number of countries on the fence. These are the countries, as I said, that I think are the most important, will ultimately decide what direction kind of the wind blows. You have there the US, you have there Brazil, India, China, many Southeast Asia countries, I think all of Southeast Asia countries, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on. And then a number of countries in Africa, Egypt, South Africa, all very important countries. So those are that's the on the fence countries as I see them. And then you have a few countries, they call themselves the like-minded group, but I think they've been trying to stall progress a little bit, if I may say that. So the coalition, the like-minded coalition, is Iran, Saudi Arabia, so some Middle Eastern countries, also Russia, Cuba. Those are the kind of countries that have 17 countries in total. And that's the kind of country in there. It was a bit unclear kind of if China and India are going to join them or not. At some point it looked like yes, at some point it looked like no. They've been going a bit back and forth. As far as I understand so far, India and China are not in that group, but they're not very far from that group. And of course, China and India have very big, influence on the global geopolitics. And so their position will be very, very important.
Thanks, Yoni. Last question from my side. What are your next steps you're going, and how do you think you can, you mentioned there is a chance to break down the analysis on different countries or specific countries, and maybe it makes sense to target the second group of countries in the first place. What is your strategy for the next month until INC5?
Yeah, great question. Before I answer that, maybe one quick thing on the previous question on coalitions, which I didn't mention, is companies, because there's also a wonderful coalition called the Business Coalition for a Global Plastic Treaty. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. They've been active. They launched about 2 years ago, right before the negotiations formally started. And this has been about 200 businesses, and they showed up in every INC, but particularly in INC4 in Ottawa, in a very strong way. Essentially, what they're asking for is global rules. So they're basically saying that for business for the plastic system and for companies in the plastic value chain to succeed, we need certainty, we need global rules, we need standards, we need definitions. So it's one of those cases where you see the industry asking governments to be regulated. I think they have a very compelling set of arguments and very compelling materials. I know many companies are on the call today. If some of you maybe are not part of the coalition, I would definitely encourage you to get interested and to you can also ask me, I can also connect, but you can also reach out to them directly. I think they're doing some really wonderful job, and also engaging a lot with member states, with countries, to explain why harmonized rules can help companies. If you have more regulatory certainty, you can take more risk, you can make more investments, you can invest into innovation, all these things that businesses want to do to find solutions. You need a regulatory framework in place to do that. And today, without one, or every country has a different definition, a different set of EPR, a different set, it's very difficult for businesses to really take action. So that's been wonderful to watch. To your question, Uwe, our focus in the next few months will be mostly on working with these on-the-fence countries, as we call them, really trying to help them understand, A, the work that we've done so far, but more importantly, what are the specific impacts on them. From the conversation so far, what they're mostly interested in is the impact on jobs. And so we're trying to focus really on how much production of plastic happens in every country by type of plastic, what the impacts are of different scenarios, and what are ways to ensure that employment and the plastic sector in general will find other ways to continue strong economic activity and high employment without, all the risks and the unintended consequences of plastic pollution that comes to the environment. So that is definitely going to be our focus between now and Korea, which is INC 5 in November, and honestly beyond that, because the treaty is going to be the global text, but after that, there's going to be a lot of work for probably 2 or 3 years at least of countries to actually implement some of this work. And so Systemic hopes to work with some of these countries to implement these policies in the best way possible.
Thank you very much. So I think we should close the discussion now because lunch break is over very soon. Yoni, thank you so much for donating your time to our little community here.